I'm not the house of cards that falls down easily. Oh, I'm strong enough to handle what you throw at me.
Welcome to Mental Health News Radio. I'm your host, Kristin Sunanta Walker. Just what are we going to discuss? The intimacy that is mental health. Let's continue to make it as comfortable as discussing brain health or heart health. This show has been on the air for several years, and we have amazing co-hosts. And then we created a network of podcasters on mentalhealthnewsradionetwork.com, a place where every possible facet of mental well-being can be talked about openly. My show, after several hundred interviews, the format is this: intimate, deep, funny, touching, sometimes uncomfortable, but always vulnerable conversations with interesting people. The goal is to have you, our listening family, many of you who have become my good friends, feel as though you are listening in on private conversations. Thank you for tuning in and becoming part of this amazing journey with me, and now with our network of podcasters. Just knowing this podcast might be helping any of you realize you are not alone on this journey called being a human being makes doing this podcast worth every second.
After all, we promised we'd be cordial.
Hi, everyone. We have an excellent new podcast that's out in the podcast world, and we also have that podcast joining Mental Health News Radio Network. I'm excited to kind of find out who the person is. It's a big mystery. You'll hear her voice in just a second, but I'm excited about doing this first show so that her listeners of her podcast can know her story before she gets into the stories of everyone else. It's our first, true crime podcast on the network, and I'm really excited to have Jan Canty with us. Hi, Jan.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. So let's go, what's the saying? Let's start from the beginning, which I know is it's quite a story for you to tell, and I know you've told it many, many times, but this is kind of setting a tone for what it is you're going to be sharing on this podcast.
Right. The beginning. Well, I was married to another psychologist. I was 18 years his junior. At the time we met, I had never even stepped foot in college, but through his encouragement did. And one thing led to another. I ended up becoming a psychologist as well. During the last, I'd say 6 months of my postdoctoral fellowship training, he went missing. It was really unexpected and not like him to even be late. So I began to panic pretty soon and called every place I could think of, got nowhere, even got my neighbor involved. This is about midnight by this time, and went down to his office. Nothing turned him up. So the next morning I reported him missing, and that too led nowhere. If we could go forward about a week, I spent that week just waiting, and I got a phone call from the Detroit Police Headquarters from a detective, Marilis Landeros, from Homicide Division, which was a big red flag there, saying she wanted me to come down for an interview. So I did. And at that point in time, now we're talking again 1985, with forensics was very different. At that time, she introduced me to Inspector Gil Hill, who was very straightforward and a man of very few words, and asked very few questions, and then said to me, I'll never forget his words, he said, "We don't have a body, but we believe your husband's been murdered, and we will find who did this."
Wow.
And it wasn't long after that, maybe, I can't remember exactly, maybe 2 days later, Detective Landero said, "I'm coming by to pick you up." And I thought, this is probably it. And she took me again back down to the 5th floor of police headquarters. And basically, they told me this story that made no sense to me. I felt like they were introducing me to my husband, actually, because what they, in a nutshell, said is that he had been leading a secret life for 18 months with 2 people from this Cass Quarter area, which is a slum at that time. And basically what happened, we believe, is that he'd been giving them money and favors and cars and paying a rent and doing this, that, and the other, and ran out of money.
Mm.
And their reward for that was to clobber him over the head with a baseball bat and then
Wow.
proceed to dismember him. And his body parts were scattered everywhere, up and down I-75 corridor. And they had collected them and brought the pieces to the Detroit Wayne County morgue. And then Detective Landero said, you need to come to the morgue with me and identify his head.
Oh my gosh.
And I didn't think my feet could make me walk that distance. It wasn't very, I mean, all I had to do was get in her car. She drove, she got me there. She led me down the corridor and she said, all you have to do is say yes or no. That's it. And I asked her why I had to do this, because I had no knowledge of the crime. I didn't know anything about what had happened. And at the time, what she said was, because it'll help you to realize he's never coming home. In retrospect, I think the other reason was they wanted me to testify in court as to the identity of who they found. But I really believe they just wanted my physical presence in the courtroom because of the impact it would have on the jury. Wow. So we proceeded to do that identification process. And I went home and my world just imploded at that point in time. And then the media descended, and then there was the, the preliminary exam hearing, which I was subpoenaed to go to. And that was the first time I had ever seen the perpetrators, the accused, in person. I'd seen their faces in the newspaper up to that point in time, but that was all.
It's much different when you see it in person, isn't it?
Oh, very. And I shifted at that. We're talking now maybe 4 months later. At this point in time, I had shifted from being frightened to being really, really angry. And I remember walking, and these two people, to picture them, I mean, the man, John Carl Fry Sr., looks like the Mr. Clean guy on the disinfectant bottle.
Wow.
Except he's got tattoos everywhere. And his accomplice was sort of the other extreme. She was much younger, very frail looking, gray looking, checked out, just not there. And I was so angry. I remember it was a very packed courtroom. And when they called me to the witness stand, I was the first witness to be asked to come forward. I remember as I was walking through this very crowded aisle to get to the front of the courtroom, the defense table was to my left. And because of the crowd, what I pretended was that they had pushed me and I slapped my hand on the defense table. But really, I was just saying to them, I'm here. We got you. I'm angry. And you're going to hear from me. I was so angry.
Wow.
So they swore me in and they asked me very few questions. I mean, the prosecuting attorney, the DA. And basically all he asked me was, did you go to the morgue? Yes. What did you see? I told him. And then the kind of a bizarre question, he said, did you give anybody permission to dismember the body in any way? I said, no.
Oh my gosh.
And he asked me a little bit about how long we've been married and this and that, and kind of superficial stuff after that. And then the defense counsel got up and he had no further questions, which I thought, yeah, you can't wait to get me out of here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I glared at them as I stood up to leave. And I thought it was kind of strange that neither of them would look me in the eye. She looked like she wasn't even there, like she was bored.
Oh, man.
And I walked by them, walked out. I did not go to the trial. Instead, I went to Arizona to be with my family. And basically, it was fending off the media after that for a couple of years, actually. And I eventually ended up saying, this isn't going to end. And I'm tired of being the victim. I'm tired of being called the widow. There's more to my life than this. Right. And I packed up, I left, I changed my name. And basically, this was back before the internet. So it wasn't that difficult to kind of go under the radar. And I did. I taught college in the middle of nowhere. I didn't tell a soul about what had happened, and I did not proceed to talk about it for 30 years.
Wow.
And then what happened to change all that was I moved again further west, and I was at work, and I attended a lecture by a physician, and he was talking. He was an offhanded comment. It was not even the primary point he was trying to make. It was rather offhandedly. He said, "And people that live with a secret for years really pay a price physically." And I remember sitting there like I'd been struck by lightning, thinking about what he is. I don't even remember the rest of what he said, but I remember that sinking in, and I thought, wow. And it just coincidentally happened at that point in time that we had a coworker that was missing. So people were coming up and saying, "Can you imagine having a member of your family missing and not know what
Right.
happened?" And I'm thinking, oh, don't I? But I put on the smile, and it was this automatic, no, I can't imagine that. And I went to my office and I sat there and I put those two pieces together in front of me. And I thought, here on the one hand, I'm keeping this secret, and look how automatically I just responded.
Right.
It's an indication of just how in the dark I am, how much I'm not being authentic myself. And at that moment in time, the third piece and the last piece of what transpired was that I looked up on my shelf in my office where I had made a collection of books of people who'd been through trauma and come through it and wrote about their experiences. And they were from all different walks of life. There was a book about the Chilean miners who were trapped underground for 69 days. There was a story called Hostage about a woman who was held hostage with her poor little daughter was dynamite strapped to her back until she opened the safe at the bank, and so on and so forth. And I got to thinking, if they can tell their story, I can start telling mine. And I finally cautiously came out and started talking about it. And now here I am with a podcast about it.
Right. Right. And what's when we talked about this, you said, well, I'm not going to be talking about my story really on the podcast, and you will. It'll filter its way in little bits and pieces into episodes that you do. But just so your listeners know, and my listeners as well, what is the theme going to be? What is your focus on, about in terms of doing the show and who you'll have on and the discussions they'll have?
The overarching theme is the domino effect of murder. That is, what is the repercussions, the aftermath of homicide on those that grieve. But it also will entail a few episodes of dealing with people that are not directly related to the victim. It might be first responders, it might be witnesses or coworkers. But I want to shed light on just how complicated and long-standing the repercussions are, because, quote, true crime, as most people are introduced to it, it's like it focuses on the perpetrator and the victim.
Right.
And once it falls off the front page and the movie's over, you switch it off and it's like, oh, well, that was a good story. And that's not where the story ends.
Right.
That's in some ways, that's the beginning.
And it's not sewn up with a nice little bow in an hour.
No, it is not. In fact, I'm going to have one, I haven't recorded it yet, but I'm going to have one series where it shows the impact across 3 generations.
Phenomenal. I mean, that's why we are in the mental health field, is to show one of the many reasons, but, doing what you said, showing how something like this affects people in so many places, some that may not even know, have never met the actual people that are in the story, but they had to work the case. I mean, there's just so many ways that this ripples out and has an effect on society as a whole. And there isn't a net to catch you, a mental health net. I mean, there is for us, those of us in the field, we know about the net, but people that aren't in the field, they need that mental health net too. And there's not really an obvious place to go to get that kind of help.
So that's another thing I want to introduce on the show is resources and introduce them to whether it's a good book or have them familiar with Marcy's Law or the importance of victim advocate, none of which was there when I was going through this. And I know what it's like to be in the wilderness by yourself. I mean, thank goodness I had Detective Landeros. I don't know what I would have done without her, because she was my guide, but so many people didn't even have that. And you're just bewildered. I mean, you're functioning, first of all, in no sleep. you're exhausted and you're frightened, and the court's not going to help you. The police usually will not help you. They want to solve the case. They're not there to hold your hand.
Right.
You're not charged with a crime, so you have no attorney as your advocate. People don't want to talk to you who know you because it's like, I don't know what to say to this person. So they avoid you, and you're alone. You're extremely alone. And when it's your spouse that dies, and I had no family within 900 miles of me, you're completely by yourself. Mm-hmm. And I want to change that. I want people to be aware that there are resources out there now, thank goodness. And I thought a podcast would be a good format for that, because when you're going through this, you're so exhausted and overwhelmed. I cannot imagine anybody being in the position of being able to sit down and get through a book. You can't concentrate that well.
Just read the same sentence over and over and over again and get nothing out of it. Yeah.
And some people may not be willing or may not be able to make it to a group meeting, or may not even know that there's one available. So that's out. The idea of seeing a psychologist or social worker or psychiatrist terrifies them. They're not likely to do that. They might go see clergy. That might happen. But many of them just sit and shudder and don't know where to turn.
Right.
And fortunately for me, I have a relative by the name of Holly Dubois, who was the one that put the idea in my mind of having a podcast. She does crime scene cleanup through her company called Diligent Decon. And she put the idea in my head. And at first I'm like, I don't know anything about this technically and especially. But with her encouragement, I tried it, and I think I'm going to like it.
Yeah, you are going to like it. And here's the thing that I've heard from literally thousands of people, because many of my shows were digging through what it's like to be in a relationship with someone who is a malignant narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath, many shows on that topic. And so many people listening that are in just huge amounts of trauma. They may be in that relationship still. And so they can't watch something on TV or, on an iPad, because there's the danger of, whoever I'm with is going to see what I'm watching. But boy, they can, play it on a podcast, and it's audio only. And a lot of people have said, I just listened to the same show sometime when you were talking about, you're not getting any sleep or no meaningful sleep. A way for them to fall asleep was to listen to shows, and that could, take them away enough that they could maybe get an hour here and there and have the comfort of hearing someone's voice that they know understands what they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
So that alone, with what you're doing, people will be able to have that same experience of hearing your guests, hearing what they've went through, hearing you're the familiar one each time. And thank God you come from this field, psychology. So, you've got that in the way that you'll word your questions. It's just going to be so beneficial.
That's my hope. That's my hope. And so far, it's just getting launched, but so far I've been blessed with having people willing to step up and talk about their stories. And they are so different one from another. People who've lost their children. I've had, it ranges. I've had a sad story. I just finished recording of a little 2-year-old that was murdered. Mm. And you look at her sweet little face and her photograph, and you cannot imagine that she could become a homicide victim when she's only 2.5 years old. And people that have had workplace violence situations. And it's just going to be, I think, opening up the door and letting people in to see how many different ways it can not only affect people, but some of the strengths that it can tap into. I've been amazed at what I have listened to so far, and I really end up admiring them, because so many of them have found productive ways to channel their frustration and are articulate in explaining what they've been through, and you got to admire them for that.
Yeah, that's interesting too. When we have a new network within our network for first responders and their mental health. And it's been really interesting to hear so many different stories and how the trauma of just doing what they do every day on a daily basis impacts them, their families, their careers, everything, and to hear how eloquent they are in sharing, what it's like to, be the detective that shows up on a case like yours. So, that kind of thing, and how that impacts them, and the kind of concern. I mean, we interviewed someone who was working on a very high profile murder case, and it was so infested throughout their neighborhood because it was someone who was murdering children, and the just absolute anxiety, crippling anxiety that it ended up overtaking them because of their concern that every time they left their own home to go and work on this case, they were worried that one of their kids was going to be next.
Oh, sure. I can understand that.
So when you were going through this, was there a part of you that was concerned about retaliation at you for being in the courtroom or was that not a part of it because they were caught?
In the beginning, I did have some concerns, especially before they were apprehended. But even afterwards, Detective Landeros gently told me one day, she said, I don't know if you've noticed that we've been following you. And I go, no.
Oh.
And she said, yeah, we want to make sure everybody's caught because we don't know the length and depth of this. And that's when I got concerned. But I think later on, I wasn't that concerned about it. I felt like they'd gotten the two people that they needed to get, and I was surrounded by the media all the time, which in a strange way, I felt safer because of that. I don't know if that's true or not. And I think I was just so in survival mode. I didn't have time. It would have been a luxury to think about all the ramifications. I was more worried about immediate things like, where am I going to get the money to make this next house payment? Because I had just finished my postdoc, and he had bankrupted us, basically. I mean, all of our savings was gone. And I found out he even had given away I had assembled a photo album of the contents of our house in case there was a fire, with the associated worth of what I thought these items were worth and where they were located, so that we could easily turn it into the insurance company if a fire or something like that broke out. He'd even given that away. So somebody had that information too. That was disconcerting. But after all of that, I was so tired and I was so worried about survival. I mean, how was I going to make the next payment? How was I going to eat? How could I afford it? I was in a house I did not want. It was huge. It was a 6-bedroom, 6-bathroom house with a carriage house, which I never wanted. He had to have it. And it didn't even get furnished until I was done with my PhD. I just didn't care. I was going back and forth to school. That's what was important to me. And so here I am sitting in this ginormous place. I didn't even want it. And I was having trouble selling it because in Michigan at the time, I don't know if it's changed, but back then at the time, there was a law in the books that stated when you sold your residence, and if there was a crime associated with the owners of the residence, you had to communicate that to the buyer. Because if they were superstitious and they found out later, even if the crime didn't happen in the house, and they found out later, they could rescind the purchase, even years later. So it meant you had to disclose all this information. And so that was another violation, and it made some people back out so that the house was devalued.
Right.
And in the end, it was so hard to sell that I was still in it when one of the defendants had served her time.
Wow.
And was already back on the street.
How was that moment for you when I'm assuming that you were notified that?
No, I didn't know anything because this is before Marsy's Law. So I found out through the newspaper eventually, and it made me mad. It's like, she's skipping around doing whatever, and I'm still here trying to pick up the pieces.
Right.
However, her co-defendant got life without the chance of parole, and it did end up dying behind bars, but not that long after, maybe 5 years before he died of Hep C. And that was fine with me.
Yeah, I bet. What was it like for you to, uncover, because I'm sure it happened in layers, how much you didn't know about this person that you married?
Well, I went through shock and disbelief, like, no, you got this wrong. You don't know my husband. He's a shy, if anything, awkward person. He's not a ladies' man by a stretch of the imagination, because she was a prostitute. He was a pimp. So that added another layer of curiosity on the part of the media. I went through shock. I went through fear, as I said, especially when they weren't sure who else was involved. More shock when I realized we had nothing left in the bank. And then anger. And then it was ducking the media and putting my head in the sand and just trying to figure out what's my next move. I'm so tired of this. I don't want this to be my swan song. What am I going to do with my life? And I also felt really foolish, because here I am, a mental health expert, and I've lived under the roof with somebody pretending to be somebody else and didn't get a whiff of it. Right. So in a time when I'm brand new to the profession, so it really made me question my abilities. It's like, am I cut out for this? How could I miss this? And people ask me the same question. I could really relate when I watched Sue Klebold's interview on Columbine, and she said people said the same thing to her. Right. How could you not know? And I thought, I get that question a lot. And so I went through trying to answer that question myself. And that took me through the winter. I'd say I really spent a lot of time on that. And so it made me feel really inept. And then that's when I decided I've got to get out of here, and I've got to spend my energies to recreating my life and deciding what the next chapter is. But it was various reactions, and it took place over a good year or two.
How long was it before you wrote the book? And please tell our listeners and your listeners the name of the book.
The name of the book, as I proposed it to be, it's yet unpublished, is A Life Divided. And it took me probably 28 years between when the event happened and when I started writing it to sit down and actually start composing it. And it was through my friends that I initially said, after I'd moved, I don't know how the conversation came up. I don't remember that, but it was one of these things. It's like I was talking to my friend and I said, there's a part of me you don't know. And she says, what do you mean? And this is after she'd known me, 3-4 years. Well, there's more to the story about my life in Detroit. Mm-hmm. And I started telling her, and of course her jaw dropped, and I shared it with a couple of other people, and they kind of urged me to write the book. And at first I was going to write as a novel to kind of distance myself from it. And then one of the detectives on the case, who I still am in contact with, he said, why write a novel when the truth is better?
Right.
So I did. And I hope somebody will pick it up and be interested in publishing it.
Yeah, absolutely. They will. And, doing this as a podcast will help also. It'll you may end up with, a book coming right after it. Not that I know just writing the first one is like, I'm done.
Yes, that's how I feel. I also want to make the point that clarify that I did not write this book for self-therapy. People will make that assumption about it. This must be get you closure and help you.
Cathartic, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And no. I wanted to make sure my ducks were in a row before I started writing it, because that's unfair to the reader to do that. Mm. And so I didn't write it for that reason. Again, it's like the podcast. I wanted to write it to say there's more to the story than the headlines. And this is the reality of what happens, that prostitution is not a victimless crime, that the story does not end when somebody dies in prison. And if I survived it, so can you.
Right. I want to ask you one last question. It relates to the media. I know you were in full on trauma and just getting, figuring out, am I going to end up homeless as this is going on? Can I make my next house payment? How am I going to eat? But I've been in a media storm too at one point, and I was too traumatized by what was going on as the reason why to be just completely horrified at how insensitive people can be. Mm-hmm. That came years later. But for each person, it's different. So were there times as you were going through this where, yes, the media is just doing their job, but sometimes they can just, it's almost, you look sometimes at the questions they ask or the lengths that they'll go to. They're victimizing the victim again in many cases with their behavior. And I just remember thinking, how do you go to bed at night? This is what you do to people.
How do you look in the mirror?
Yeah. So did you have those moments as you were being hounded, or were those, like for me, it happened later?
Well, let me give you a short story about that. The best answer I can give you was at the funeral. I went early. It was a very hot, muggy July day. And I went early because I wanted to be by myself. My parents had flown in, and they were godsend. But I needed to be by myself for just a few minutes and get in air conditioning, even though it was already sweltering outside, even though it was still morning. And I got to the funeral home early, and the undertaker met me, and I said more than one time, do not allow the media in here at all. They are not welcome. I don't want them. They have no right to be here. I could not have been clearer on that point with him. And he never reassured me. He said, well, it's a public sidewalk. And I go, that I'm not debating. But what goes on in your building is up to you. And I'm telling you, I do not want them in here. Well, we'll do the best we can. I mean, he was really wishy-washy about it. And I'm like, oh, no. So I sat in the front, and people filtered in, and I was hoping for almost a no-show. I would have been happy if 3 people had come.
Right.
But instead, I kept hearing the group behind me getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I didn't even turn around. I didn't want to talk with anybody. I just wanted to get it over with and go home. And at the conclusion of the short eulogy, I asked him to be kind of right to the point. And he did a great job. That was Dr. Mooney that spoke. As I was getting up out of my seat to leave, and I don't even think I was at full posture standing up yet, I had a guy shove one of those big video cameras that you hoist on your shoulder within inches of my nose and stick a microphone in my face. And I crumbled at that point. That was like the last straw. My friend's husband put his hand over the lens, and I vaguely remember crumpling into my friend's lap saying, is nothing off limits? Is nothing off limits? And I just covered my head and put my face in her lap until they led me out the back door. And John, her husband, said, just take my car. And I went home and locked all the doors and went up to my bed and covered my head. And that's how insensitive they became.
I remember years later, I was with someone else, a friend who was going through their own trauma, and the media was there. And I don't feel bad for the person that got my wrath, but it was my wrath of my own stuff and for my friend. It wasn't just for my friend. And I remember confronting the media person that was there, did something similar to what you're talking about. And they're somewhere on camera long before the internet, there's me going, you horror of a human being. I mean, I went off, and they just said, hey, it's my job. And that was that.
Yep.
Taught me a lot about people and what we can tell ourselves is okay.
One of the people I'm going to be interviewing is a journalist. And I'm not saying he was that kind of a journalist, but he was in that field. And then his son was murdered, and he got the wrath of the media. And he, after that point in time, had nothing to do with them. He just basically turned in his credentials. It looks so different when you're on the other side.
Right. Exactly. And we've had Mike Resendez on many times. He's a part of he's now with a different outfit, but he was with the Boston Globe Spotlight team. He's part of what broke the whole Catholic Church scandal.
Oh, with the priests.
With the priests, yeah. And he, he's been on the show a couple of times, and he's one of the good guys that's out there, uncovering these kinds of stories. But the media is a whole different world today than it was. I mean, everybody is media because everyone has a smartphone.
That's true.
So,
And everybody's hoping to catch you in an awkward moment and up close and personal. And it can never be undone once it's out there, which is frightening.
Absolutely. Oh boy, I've had to just get to a point where I go, okay, that's there. Somebody has their opinion, some whack job on social media decides to dissect me in a very cruel way. They don't take into account all the work that we do, but they, have some kind of screw loose in their head. And I've learned to just go, yep, it's part of what happens when you're somebody in the public.
So are you saying this is what I have to look forward to?
Well, you've already dealt with it, I mean, you really have already dealt with it. I will say this though, I know you don't think about it. I don't think what a resilient person I am. It's not the way I think, but when I look at you and what you've been through, I mean, you are so resilient. Does that ever hit you even for a nanosecond sometimes where you go, look at what the hell I can live through?
Not that often, maybe once in a blue moon. When I tell my story, well, usually and people will go, you did what? What happened? What? Back up.
Right.
Then it kind of like, oh yeah. But I credit my parents with that more than anything. They were terrific parents. I did not realize how good I had it till I became a psychologist and you start hearing these stories from other people's backgrounds. It's like, yikes.
Right.
But they were really a formidable team. When they said you do something, you do it to the best of your ability. They would support me 100%. If I said I want to try for the band or I want to try for softball, they were like, go for it. And they'd show up at every game and they'd hold my feet to the fire. And there was no excuses. If you wanted to do something, do it, but don't say it and not follow through.
Right.
And they had a great sense of humor. They loved people. They were inquisitive about the world. And they never let me feel sorry for myself for anything that I had to deal with. I was born with some physical issues, and they never let me feel sorry for myself because of it. And they would say, it just makes you special, get on with life. You think you got it bad, look at this, come on. And I just think they just were great parents. And that I attribute to my ability to get through this as good as I did. Because at the time it broke, as I said, I was by myself. I mean, I had nobody to lean on. And I just took it a day at a time, sometimes an hour at a time. And I did. And in fact, part of my recovery, I would say years later, was when I decided to start facing some of this. Is one of the things I did. I was teaching a graduate class in cross-cultural psychotherapy. And I thought, if I'm going to teach this class effectively, I'd better get away and start looking at the world firsthand. So I started traveling internationally to places that were far-flung in remote villages, and I started doing photography along with it. And boy, did that open my eyes. It was like, I have clean drinking water. I don't have to worry about my kids being eaten by an elephant.
Right.
I don't have a lot of problems that a lot of people face. This is really not that big of a deal compared to people who live day to day with, am I going to live through not tomorrow? Because they're in a civil war. I mean, there's just so many things that go on in people's lives. And that put it really into perspective for me. That was very healing. And then I decided I should do as much as I could physically. So I started doing triathlons and that ended up actually saving my life, because this is kind of a sidebar, but I was training to do another triathlon and I slipped and fell and broke my arm and went into the hospital. And they said, you got cancer. That's why your arm broke.
Geez.
And I'm like, really? Oh, well, kind of. And they told me I had multiple myeloma, which is not a great prognosis. And so I did the slash burn treatment and stem cell transplant. And that was now 5 years ago. And I refused to go on chemotherapy after I got out of the treatment. So far, so good. So maybe, just maybe, I dodged that bullet too. I don't know. We'll see.
Right. Again, resiliency. I mean, I know the people that are the most resilient do not sit and go, I am so darn resilient.
No, you just got time.
Exactly. You just keep on plugging.
That's right.
Well, let's let the listeners know how they can, I'll tell them how they can find the show, but let's let them know what the name of the show is.
Sure. I've called it The Domino Effect of Murder.
And where can they find more about you?
On my website, www.jancantyphd, And I will also have a Facebook page until the show gets launched, just under Domino Effect of Murder.
Fantastic. And just so everyone knows, it's JANCANTYPHD.com. And you can find the Domino Effect of Murder on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, any app that you use to listen to podcasts. Just look up Domino Effect of Murder and you'll be able to find it. Jan, thank you so much for joining the network and for also doing this podcast.
Oh, I'm honored, and I hope that I can be a good resource for the people that listen. And I really want to thank you for allowing me to tell my story.
Absolutely. Listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Mental Health News Radio.
Sometimes I'm passive aggressive, but never without good intentions. I heat up and act on my emotions.
Thanks so much for listening to Mental Health News Radio. Our podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and hundreds of other podcast apps, or you can visit our website at mentalhealthnewsradio.com. If you have a question or would like to be a guest, become a podcaster on our network, or join the amazing organizations that help keep us on the air, please email us at info@mhnrnetwork.com. Get ready for that special goodbye from our resident therapy dog, Miles, and a special thanks to Emily Sohn for letting us use her incredible song, Cordial, for our podcast music. Listen to the full song on SoundCloud at emily.sonne.
Don't be surprised when I don't hate on you. After all, we promised we'd be cordial. Sometimes in you I can find it, but I
Good boy.